Good evening, everybody. My name is Thomas Beuter. I'm the International Product Manager for Biometry with Haag-Streit. I would like to welcome you to this webinar on understanding topography and corneal aberrations and how to use this technology to its fullest with Warren Hill. I would like to welcome Warren Hill here with us online. Warren Hill has been the medical director for East Valley Ophthalmology in Mesa, Arizona for the past 35 years. He specializes in consultative ophthalmology, challenge anterior segment surgery for other ophthalmologists. And as you all know, he's very much interested in intraocular lens power calculations, and he's the original author of the Hill RBF formula. He's also doing numerous lectures at all different events, teaching all over the world. And yeah, I would like to welcome him for this evening session here in Europe. And I would like to hand over to Warren. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. And let's see if we can switch to my screen here. Okay. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about some basics about topography and, more importantly, corneal aberrations and how to use this technology to its fullest. And I'd really like to thank Haag-Streit for making this available to all of us, because I think this is a topic that's going to become more and more important to us as we get deeper into the premium quality lenses, such as multifocals and extended depth of field lenses, and also some of the things that are on the horizon that we're going to learn about in the years to come. Now, to begin, you know, an instrument is really only as good as the person using it. We all in our offices have this dizzying array of instrumentation, but I think most of us would admit that we don't really know how to use all the features. And an example would be a pencil, you know, one of the simplest instruments of all. But in the hands of someone like Claude Monet, you know, it's a formidable device. In the hands of all the rest of us, it's probably something like this. So we'll begin by saying that an instrument is really only as good as the person who's using it. The initial 6 examples that I'm going to show will be of the same eye of the same patient to illustrate some basic principles of topography, and specifically those that will be coming with the iStar, which is soon to be released in Europe. So each topographic map that we're going to show of these 6 next patients is simply a different representation of the same corneal shape. Okay, so we'll begin with an axial curvature map. This is the one that most of us use. And an axial curvature map is very common because it converts curvature into power, but it has some limitations. And one of the limitations is that it assumes that all refracted light rays pass through the central optical axis. It displays an average of scaled values with some smoothing, some computer smoothing, and some detail is lost. But it's preferred clinically, as I mentioned, because it relates corneal shape to corneal power. And it's often used to characterize astigmatism, the type, the alignment, and the location, and we'll go into that in just a few minutes. So its greatest accuracy is near the region of the central cornea, and I'll show an illustration in just a minute as to the differences between this and some of the other maps. So it's useful, as I mentioned, for the characteristic of the astigmatism type, whether it's regular or irregular, alignment, asymmetric or symmetrical, and location. You know, is it with the rule astigmatism, against the rule astigmatism? And here's an example. Here's an axial curvature map of somebody with significant with the rule astigmatism. And we can use this to quantify the alignment of the steep and also the flat meridians. And this is very, very helpful for those of us that use a lot of Toric IOLs. Next is a tangential curvature map, and that's based on data points measured at a 90-degree tangent to the corneal surface. This more correctly assumes that all refracted light does not fall through a central reference axis. And it represents the corneal surface using somewhat smaller patterns, and it's useful for understanding the size and the shape of unusual areas, as in this patient that has keratoconus. It's very sensitive to local irregularities of the corneal surface, and generally better for showing transitions in curvature than the axial curvature map, and it has less data smoothing. So these are the axial assumptions that are made by an axial curvature map, and these are the tangential assumptions, and the tangential map is actually a little bit more accurate, as we mentioned. An elevation map displays the corneal height and is often used in the process of contact lens fitting. It's referenced against a theoretical best fit sphere on the corneal surface, and the elevation data is derived from the corneal curvature. And it shows areas corresponding to depressions and elevations that are above and below a best fit sphere. So on most topographic maps, the red areas are above the best fit sphere and the blue areas are below. So this would just be a schematic representation. This is our theoretical best fit sphere. And these are the areas above, these are the areas below. So pretty straightforward. Now an irregularity or a torical map uses a best fit toric surface to do the same thing. And it displays elevation differences that really cannot be accounted for with a best fit toric reference. So it's similar to an elevation map, except the reference is a best fit toric surface rather than a best fit sphere. And again, this is the same eye of the same patient. We're just looking at it differently using a different display of the topographer. So there's those areas that are blue are below the best fit toric surface, and those areas that are red are above it. Now, one of the things we're going to be spending a lot of time on during this webinar is an aberration profile. And the aberration profile is a kind of a quantitative representation of the Zernike pyramid. And it's extremely useful for understanding the reason for reduction in visual quality. And we'll talk about that, how that aligns exactly with image contrast. So the second order aberrations correspond to the patient's spectacle correction, and third and fourth order aberrations correspond to things, irregularities in the cornea, mostly forms of irregular astigmatism. So those would be like coma and trefoil and quatrefoil, second order astigmatism, and spherical aberration. And by the end of this talk, you will be able to look at an aberration profile and know, or rather look at an axial curvature map and know what the aberration profile is. None of this is difficult. It's just a little bit unfamiliar. And this is very, very important for those of us that implant multifocal lenses, because this can come up with a go decision as to those types of lenses. So I would tell you that this is mandatory preoperative screening for premium IOLs, such as diffractive multifocal IOLs, extended depth of field lenses, and some of the other lenses we'll be learning about in the years to come. And it's an important part of evaluating all patients with prior refractive surgery, because this corresponds exactly one-to-one with what patients are trying to tell you. Okay, so here's an example of keratoconus, and here we have focal steepening and apex displacement. But the center of the cornea near the vertex is actually pretty close to normal. We have dissimilar power distribution in the intermediate and marginal areas, and we're going to go into this a little bit in a few minutes, and I'll show you how that corresponds with what the patient's seeing. So briefly, here's an image simulation without any correction. And again, it's an ideal tool for showing patients the impact of higher order aberrations. In this image simulation, we've removed the second order aberrations, which means we've given the patient a pair of glasses. If we reduce the pupil size, we ameliorate the aberrations, because all aberrations are radius dependent values. So the smaller the pupil, the less the impact. And by removing third and fourth order aberrations, we can actually give patients normal vision. And this is why either a scleral contact lens or an especially fit RGP contact lens works so well for patients with keratoconus. So image simulation is an opportunity to demonstrate to the patient first that we understand what they have, and also what it is that they're seeing. So an important point is that patients who are unhappy with the quality of their vision are really telling you that the image has reduced contrast. And I'll show you some of the consequences of that happen with the older forms of refractive surgery. So explaining a concept is good, but really showing it is much better. So those of you who do photography know that the lens on the left is a used lens in a camera shop would be about $200, and the lens on the right would be about $3,300. What's the difference between these two lenses besides, one is made in Japan and one may be made in Germany or Austria. Well, it has to do with contrast. The transfer of contrast from the object being viewed to the image being formed is directly related to what the patient sees as image quality. And for the human visual system, it's really all about contrast. And we as eye surgeons, when we operate on eyes, we really need to be mindful of what it is we're doing. So this is the trick that we as ophthalmologists play on an unsuspecting public. We show them a black letter on a white background. And of course, everybody sees the black letter on the white background because it's 100% contrast. But the real world is not like this. The real world is more like 45% contrast and a little bit higher spatial frequency. So if we increase the spatial frequency, in other words, the number of items per degree, we decrease the image resolution. It's a lot easier to see a big black straight line than it is to see 125 black lines next to each other in a small space. By reducing the image contrast, we decrease image fidelity. And if we do both, we increase the spatial frequency and we decrease the contrast. It's a real problem for patients. So in common areas where we look at an image, let's say on a television screen, this is from the 1950s and 60s, you can see what we're doing is we're looking at a contrast and spatial frequency. So this is a television image from 1956 from the television program here in the United States, Captain Midnight, and it's a 576 line analog television. Only 525 of those lines were actually used for the TV image. The rest had to do with synchronization and other internal housekeeping things. But the first thing we see is that we have low image contrast at medium to high spatial frequencies. So this isn't a black and white TV, it's really a gray and gray television. And what it had was reduced image fidelity, and this was the technology of the time. So fast forward to 2021, this is a 1080p digital image, and you can see we have preserved image contrast at all spatial frequencies. We also have preserved image fidelity. A 4K television has 4 times the image resolution, but a similar contrast ratio. And an 8K television, which we're going to be seeing, in the years to come, has about 8 times the image resolution and perhaps a little bit even better contrast. So again, it's all about contrast, and we as eye surgeons need to keep this in mind as we operate on patients. So delving just a little bit into what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, here's a patient who's had prior refractive surgery. There's an axial power map with a very familiar picture of flattened central cornea and steepened in the periphery. This is a modulation transfer function plot, which we'll just talk about briefly here. And then we have an image simulation. So if we look at a 6mm pupil, you can see that the ability of the patient to see at higher spatial frequencies drops off very quickly. And that little gray-blue area in the center is what we call the happy zone. It's about 45% contrast and 20 to 30 cycles per degree. This is normal visual function. So somebody who's had this form of LASIK, first generation LASIK, is going to have a lot of trouble seeing at night. You can see their image simulation with the characteristic halo and glow. Now, as we reduce the pupil size, the influence of spherical aberration in this case is going to be less, and their image contrast is going to be normal. So a lot of these patients that had their LASIK in the 1990s will tell you that their vision at night is nowhere near as good as it is during the day, and that's because the pupil comes down and the impact of the aberrations is less. And then at a very small pupil size, it begins to almost act like a pinhole camera, and the contrast is preserved because the aberrations are less. So let's talk about some other uses for topography that we have. And one of the things that here in Arizona where I live, which is in a desert area, that's very useful for us is evaluating a dry eye or an unstable ocular surface. And here almost everybody has an unstable ocular surface. So if you look at a topographic map, here this is an axial curvature map, and you see all these multiple flat and steep islands, this isn't a patient with an abnormal cornea other than an abnormal ocular surface. And a patient like this, you would never do typical biometry on, because what you're going to get is wild variation in the keratometry from one measurement to the next, and it may misread the cornea in terms of the astigmatism and also the aberration profile. So an axial map such as this means that you stop everything, you don't do biometry, and you optimize the ocular surface first, and then bring the patient back and do biometry. And by optimize the ocular surface, we're talking about warm compresses, maybe 2 or even 4 times a day to get the meibomian glands working, lid scrubs, and of course frequent high quality artificial tears. And this may look like a completely different cornea after a couple of weeks. Remember, a 1 diopter error at the plane of the cornea is a 1 diopter spectacle plane error, so this is very important. And we as surgeons are really being judged by our patients and our peers by our refractive outcomes. So this is a very good place to put a lot of our time. So here's an example. This is a lady who wanted to be minus 150. She didn't want to wear glasses for doing intermediate work, and she ended up plano in 2020, and believe it or not, she was actually very unhappy. Her doctor sent her to us to find out why she had a refractive surprise, and this was an axial curvature map that we did on her just as she showed up in the clinic. You see this little hotspot right here. This is after having her just close her eyes for about half an hour sitting in the clinic and repeating the axial curvature map. And you can see that we normalize the power distribution across the anterior cornea. So optimizing the ocular surface can be very, very important in terms of preventing refractive surprises. Now we'll briefly go into some ways in which we can use topography for the toric IOL, and then we're going to get into aberration profiles and the Zernike polynomials. In our practice, we do a lot of toric IOLs. It's probably about 40% of what we do, and we absolutely love this platform. And let me share with you how we evaluate the cornea for the toric IOL so that we don't have any refractive misses. If you follow these recommendations, the accuracy for your toric IOL use, I guarantee, will significantly increase. So the most basic measurements we use for the toric IOL is we need to determine the orientation of the steep and the flat meridians. And we also need to measure the power difference between these 2 meridians. And these are 2 of the most fundamental aspects of the toric IOL. There are other things like surgically induced astigmatism and a few other items that are kind of outside the range of this talk. Now you might say, well, I've got a dearly beloved IOL master, I've got an Argos Movu, I have a Tomei device. I mean, my keratometry is wonderful, and that may be the case. But let me just show you how it's easy to get fooled. So this is a set of Ks from say, IOL Master 500 and earlier. The validation criteria is 3 measurements within a quarter diopter in each of the principal meridians. And as we look at these Ks, it looks like this meets the validation criteria, and perhaps we would be good to go. So here's our steep meridian, here's our flat meridian, and there's the power difference between. So, this patient would probably require something like a T3. So it looks pretty good. So let's take a look at our validation, which is the axial curvature map. And what we find is that this patient actually had prior hyperopic LASIK. So numbers are only as good as our ability to know what they mean. And when we do keratometry, we're going to get a set of numbers, but they may not actually be the correct information. So we need a method of validating it. ASCRS did a very nice study asking surgeons what it was they used to evaluate a patient for the toric IOL. And the great majority used a topography and automated biometry, either the OwlMaster or the LensStar at that time. So how can we use the combination of topography and automated keratometry to really get good results with the toric IOL? So the first step is we just obtain a standard axial curvature map. And our interest is really in the displayed central 4 millimeters. What takes place in the periphery really doesn't have any meaning for the toric IOL. Second step is we're going to look and see if the power distribution is suitable for the toric IOL. And if you have astigmatic lobes that are canted, that aren't aligned with the same meridian, or are wildly asymmetric, as in keratoconus, that may not be a good candidate. So we're looking to see, is the astigmatism regular? Do we line up with the center of each of the astigmatic lobes and the corneal vertex? And is it symmetrical, which means similar power on either side of the corneal vertex? Remember, the part of the toric IOL that has toricity is really just a cross cylinder, and it's perfectly symmetrical. Now, irregular asymmetric astigmatism is a different discussion that we don't have time for today. So the next step is, what is the orientation of the steep meridian? Very, very important, because the toric IOL, we align it with the least power of the toric IOL for the most power of the cornea. And again, we draw this line through the corneal vertex and the center of the two astigmatic lobes, and where it intersects the axis scale in the periphery is the steep meridian by definition. It can't be anything else. So anything that tells you something different is just plain wrong. So now we know, is the astigmatism regular? Is it symmetrical? And what is the steep meridian? Three important pieces of information just from the humble axial curvature map. And again, we're looking at the central 4 millimeters. So the next step is we're going to get a set of Ks. And here we look to make sure that our autokeratometry gives us the right information. So we confirm that autokeratometry agrees with what we know to be correct, which was a manually determined steep meridian. And here it looks like they line up just fine, so we're okay. So you might say, well, why do we need to go to all this trouble? You know, why would my keratometer measure any place except in the right area? Well, if the astigmatism is asymmetric or irregular, that may happen. And here's just another example using the IOL Master. This is from, I think, software version 5.4, which a lot of people are using right now. And it's helpful to keep in mind that astigmatism is a vector, which means it has magnitude and direction. And we can have a refractive error following toric IOL placement with an error in either one of these. So here's the scenario for autokeratometry using this type of biometer. You can see we have 6 measurement points, 3 above and 3 below the horizontal. And they measure at 60, let's see, at they're spaced 60 degrees apart, and we're at 30 degrees, 90 degrees, 150 degrees. Well, let's take a look at the center measurement here. There's our steep meridian, 140 degrees, our flat meridian, 150 degrees. But you see we're not measuring exactly where the biometer has determined the steep meridian can be. This is extrapolated. So let's say measurement number 1 is correct, or measurement number 3 is correct. Well, that's a pretty significant difference. We have a 15-degree angular error, and that would be a 50% reduction in the toric IOL. So it's not hard to imagine that even if we get the power difference between meridians correct, if we're off on the steep meridian, we're going to have a refractive surprise. So some form of validation is very important. And for older instruments, without validation of the steep meridian, automated keratometry alone may not be reliable as a primary instrument and may give us a refractive surprise. So as we mentioned at the beginning, a measurement is only as good as our ability to validate that's correct. And as the old Russian proverb says, you know, we trust, but we verify. Okay, so now we're going to talk about corneal aberrations. And this is one of the most important aspects in modern ophthalmology as we look to help our patients with a lot of the newer, more sophisticated lenses. And I would put to you that this is the equivalent of keys to the kingdom in understanding what the patients may be trying to tell us about the vision. Now, in 1875, Hermann Helmholtz said, you know, it's not too much to say that if an optician wanted to sell me an instrument like the eye, which had all of its defects, I should think myself quite justified in blaming his carelessness in the strongest terms and giving him back his instrument. Well, the human eye has a lot of things that are not quite perfect, and we need to work around these a little bit in order to get the best results. So why can't everybody see better than 20/20? Well, the human eye is an axially asymmetric, aspheric biologic system with its principal elements, which are the cornea, the pupil, and the lens, decentered and somewhat tilted with respect to the other components. And this renders the eye an optical device dominated by spherical aberration because of the difference in central corneal power, intermediate and marginal power, and smaller amounts of coma at the foveal center. So we're dealing with an imperfect instrument, and we need to have some idea as to the range of imperfections we're dealing with when we see if a patient is a candidate for some of these more sophisticated lenses. We're going to talk about the work of Fritz Zernike. Fritz Zernike was a Dutch mathematician who won the Nobel Prize in 1953, and the work that he did was in around 1938. And think about all that was going on in Holland, just before 1940s. And it's an astonishing accomplishment of this man. And the work that he did is the basis for most of our understanding of loss of image contrast due to corneal aberrations and to a smaller extent, the lens. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk about what are the Zernike coefficients, and we view this as an aberration profile. How do aberrations view image contrast? And what should we be looking for? How do we read an aberration profile? And how can we effectively explain this to our patients? And believe me, patients are very sophisticated. They'll understand this. As it said, there's no bad students, only bad teachers. And in our office, we spend a lot of time on a big display with image simulations. And we go over this with our patients, especially if we tell them that they can't have a multifocal lens, or we're trying to show them how they're going to see after cataract surgery when they had early generation LASIK. So this is the thing that most of us don't like to see, the corneal wavefront. This is a typical presentation. Kind of what does all of this mean? And in a few minutes, I'm going to make each of you an expert, so you'll be able to look at this and understand exactly what it means and how it impacts not only what the patient sees, but what their options are. The good news is that this is the only part that we really need to deal with, which are really third and fourth order aberrations. Is this relevant to your practice? Absolutely. So as we talked about, the human visual system at its most basic level is a contrast sensitivity dissection system. As we don't see with our eyes, we see with our brains. And the quality of any optical system is judged by its ability to transfer contrast from the object being viewed to the image that's formed. So here's a human eye, and if we have a perfect optical system, what's in front of the eye is projected on the retina in a nice way. But if we have aberrations of the cornea, or let's say they have a cataract developing and problems there, then we get a loss of contrast, is initially what the patient sees. And tonight we're just going to be talking about the cornea. So an increase in a specific aberration reduces image contrast, and that's what aberrations do. They reduce image contrast, and from the patient's point of view, they decrease the visual quality. And a reduction in contrast by an individual aberration is additive. Aberrations on the same surface don't cancel each other out, and that's a common misconception. So these are the basic Zernike coefficients. Defocus, vertical and oblique astigmatism is what I have in my glasses. Those are second order aberrations. And the aberrations we're going to talk about tonight are mostly vertical and horizontal coma and spherical aberration. And most of you already have a pretty reasonable understanding of what these are. So when we look at a topographic map and we look at coma or we look at spherical aberration, this is basically what we see. Coma is simply a form of irregular astigmatism, and whether it's negative, y-direction coma, or positive x-direction horizontal coma, it has to do with where the power is distributed on the cornea. So for y-direction coma, a negative vertical coma just means that the steepest part of the cornea is inferior, the flattest is superior or above the corneal vertex. So that's vertical coma, less power, more power, and positive vertical coma is just more power above, less power below. For spherical aberration, it's positive if there's less power in the middle, so think about myopic LASIK or even the normal human eye. And for negative spherical aberration, there's more power in the center, so think about somebody that's undergone hyperopic LASIK. So again, this is normal contrast. This is reduced contrast from elevated corneal aberration, say someone has had a lot of LASIK. And aberrations don't exist individually. They usually exist as a whole. And think of it like a chord on the violin. So these are common aberrations, and we're going to talk about spherical aberration, which is the one that most of us are familiar with. So we'll begin with that. Now, this is a graph that was presented by George Bako from Canada and Wolfgang Haggis from the University of Würzburg in Germany. And it shows that the spherical aberration for patients of mostly European ancestry is a Gaussian distribution with a mean value of about 0.274 microns. And Jack Holliday, Doug Koch, and Li Wang all basically got very, very similar numbers. So it's vertically, whether it's normally distributed when we look at it at a 6mm aperture. And that's the standard way we measure it so that everybody's on the same page. Here myopic LASIK will give us more spherical aberration because it makes the center of the cornea flatter. Hyperopic LASIK gives us less spherical aberration, sometimes going into the minus range because the center of the cornea is steeper. So these are all familiar axial curvature maps for us. A flat central cornea from prior myopic LASIK, a steep central cornea from hyperopic LASIK. Now, modern LASIK, especially with things like the Alcon Contura, are much, much better. But the patients that we're dealing with are mostly people that have had early generation LASIK that are now coming to cataract surgery. So let's look at some examples, and you can see using image simulation. So here's the average youthful eye, say the naval aviator, and there's the normal value for the cornea. Here's a mean value for the spherical aberration for the lens. It's negative. This is from Li Wang at Baylor University. And what we have is a slight positive spherical aberration value. And this is an image simulation at a 6mm pupil. So this is somebody with very, very good vision. But let's take a normal cornea and a spherical lens. And as if you're as old as I am, you probably remember when we didn't have aspheric lenses that added negative spherical aberration. And what we get is an increase in the spherical aberration. This is what the patient sees at a 6mm pupil. They can still read the eye chart, but the quality of the image is not that good. So in this case, by using a spherical lens with positive spherical aberration in the cornea, we've actually increased the net spherical aberration of the optical system and made the image have less contrast. Let's say we have somebody with prior myopic LASIK, and we use a spherical lens. We're going to be increasing the spherical aberration even more, and this is what they see. So they will tell you they don't like their vision at night very much at all. So let's go through some examples. This is an eye with prior myopic LASIK, and it's a 9-diopter ablation. So this is early generation LASIK. You can see by the sharp margins of the ablation pattern. And we have a mostly centered zone of central flattening. We have a similar power distribution in the intermediate and marginal areas. And here's our aberration profile. So you can see that our spherical aberration is elevated because we flatten the central cornea. Our aberration is mostly centered, so the coma values are not really all that high. And we have a regular intermediate zone. So basically, we're looking at spherical aberration. Remember, flat central cornea, increased positive spherical aberration. And what we get is this characteristic halo and glow. And patients will tell you who've had LASIK that if they look at a point source of light, what they see is this glow. So there's the letter E, and you can see the glow around it. So here's another patient who had 7 diopters of myopic ablation. They have a decentered zone of central flattening. Decentered means irregular astigmatism and the increasing coma. And they have similar distribution in the intermediate and marginal areas. So their spherical aberration is high. Remember, normal is 0.274. We're up, well above 1 micron. They have increased vertical coma because they have a decentered ablation, and they have a regular intermediate zone. This really isn't that hard. Again, it's just unfamiliar. So here's their 6mm image simulation. There's their elevated spherical aberration. There's their elevated horizontal coma. And here's their elevated vertical coma. So these eyes are multifocal and they create different images due to the different aberrations. So here's a radiologist who was a high axial myope, had early generation myopic LASIK, had more treatment in the left eye than in the right, and the doctor put in a diffractive multifocal lens. The surgery looked perfect, but the patient was bitterly unhappy because she couldn't drive and she couldn't work. The refraction wasn't that bad for somebody that's had myopic LASIK, but she came to us to find out what happened. So there's her left eye. There's some myopic ablation, and immediately we can see that it's decentered. So we know because it's flatter, the spherical aberration is higher. Because it's decentered, she's going to have vertical coma. And then we have widely variable power in the intermediate and marginal areas. Not as important for us as ophthalmologists, but this tells us that things like trefoil are probably going to be elevated. So flatter in the center, we have elevated spherical aberration. Decentered ablation means we're going to have elevated vertical coma. And then there's our elevated trefoil. Let's go back here. So this is this patient with her current cornea that's had myopic LASIK. This is as if she hadn't had LASIK and the spherical aberration of the cornea had not been corrected. And this is how she would see if she had just a regular aspheric lens with the additional spherical aberration. Here's her cornea, and then here's her cornea with the multifocal IOL. You can see why she's so unhappy. So the patient underwent a lens exchange and was able to return to work and also drive at night. This is Hyperopic LASIK, and we can see that we have a steepened area in the middle. That's 3.5 diopters of hyperopic treatment. Of course, we wouldn't do a toric IOL for these people because we can't see the steep and the flat meridian. So we have a decentered zone of central steepening, which because it's steeper in the middle, it means we're going to have negative spherical aberration. Because it's decentered, it means we're going to have coma. And we have dissimilar power in the intermediate and marginal areas, which means we're also going to have trefoil. So here's our spherical aberration. We knew that. It's going to be high, but it's going to be negative, not positive. Here's our vertical coma. It's off the charts because we have a decentered ablation. And then we have some elevation because of the intermediate zone. So here's our elevated spherical aberration. Here's our elevated vertical and horizontal coma. And this is what these patients are seeing at a 6mm pupil. Okay, and then here's our keratoconus patient that we began with. We have a near normal corneal vertex. We have inferior nasal steepening. And you could think of this like hyperopic LASIK gone wild, just steep down there and then also decentered. And we have variable power. So if we look at the aberration profile, you can see spherical aberration near the corneal vertex is going to be close to normal, but our coma is going to be wildly elevated because we have this form of irregular astigmatism. There's their 6mm pupil. There's a 4mm pupil with glasses. And then a keratoconus or scleral contact lens gets rid of all these irregularities. Last one we're going to talk about is quatrefoil. Here's somebody that's had prior radial keratotomy, 4-incision radial keratotomy. But if you look at the center of the cornea, it's completely normal. So automatically you know that this is going to be normal spherical aberration, and most of the other aberrations are going to be trefoil. They're going to be in the periphery. So we have some variable horizontal power, variable power at the intermediate and marginal areas, so probably some coma as well. So there's their aberration profile. We have some quatrefoil, spherical aberrations normal, and some trefoil, and a mild elevation of coma. So again, you're now an expert. You can look at these, and if you're flat or steep in the center, you know that that affects spherical aberration. If you have very asymmetric or very irregular astigmatism, you're going to have coma. And some of these wild changes in the periphery are going to induce quatrefoil or trefoil. So here's a scotopic pupil, and there's our image simulation. Photopic pupil is going to be normal because it looks normal in the center. Now, what type of lenses do we use for these patients? Well, it depends on what they have. And if they have a flat central cornea, we're going to use an aspheric lens that adds negative spherical aberration. And that would go for radial keratotomy or myopic LASIK or PRK. If they've had hyperopic LASIK and the spherical aberration value has been reduced to a near normal level, we could use a lens that's aspherically neutral, like the LA61AO, or if they have a lot of negative spherical aberration, like we showed in the example, they could use a spherical lens like the SN60AT. And with those lenses, the amount of spherical aberration is dependent on the power. So with 30 diopters, that will have a lot more spherical aberration than, say, a 12 diopter lens. Now, is the future going to be something like this, where we're going to write a prescription for glasses based on defocus, first order astigmatism, horizontal coma, trefoil? I don't think so. But already in Asia, I'm starting to see some glasses manufacturers and contact lens manufacturers that actually add spherical aberration, which is kind of interesting. So this may be something in the future. So we're going to finish up here with a post-lecture test. And again, all of you are now experts in this. And let's take a look at this eye, and I bet you can tell me exactly what we're going to see on the aberration profile. We're going to start with somebody that's had myopic LASIK, and they're flatter in the center, and that ablation is slightly decentered. So we know that the spherical aberration is going to be positive, and it's going to be elevated. And because it's decentered, we're going to have various forms of coma. It's not decentered too much vertically, but it's decentered significantly horizontally. So we have a lot of horizontal coma. Normal values for coma are like 0.1 microns, maybe 0.2. Here we have more than 1 micron of coma. So this would not be a patient who would have a multifocal lens, because the reduction in contrast from the cornea in front of a lens that purchases the 2 focal points in the currency of contrast might not be tolerated. And here in the intermediate marginal areas, we have widely variable power. So we're going to see elevated trefoil and quadrifoil. So there's their image simulation, which is pretty much what we thought. Okay, so just to review quickly, aberrations reduce image contrast, each in a very specific way. Spherical aberration produces a characteristic halo and glow. Coma produces image duplication and displacement. And the other aberrations, mostly in the periphery, are less important for us, but they also can be additive and reduce image contrast. As I mentioned before, we should be mindful of what our plans for surgery will do to the contrast sensitivity of our patients. If somebody's had a lot of LASIK, they have high spherical aberration values, we do not want to be putting in a diffractive multifocal lens. If they have very high coma values, again, which is a form of irregular astigmatism, we should think twice about perhaps putting in a toric IOL, because the cornea is very asymmetric and the toric IOL is very symmetrical. And in some situations, we can actually make the coma worse. Visual quality and patient satisfaction are directly related to the preservation of image contrast. And this is a new concept for a lot of surgeons, to think about how we influence image contrast. And from the patient's point of view, image contrast is the whole game. That's what they're most interested in. And said in kind of a nice way, anybody who tells you something differently is probably selling something. This is about as accurate as it gets. So thank you very much from the Arizona desert and for your attention. And I look forward to perhaps having another meeting and discussion with you in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Warren, for this very nice presentation. Everybody should feel free to add questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom meeting chart. We already have got some questions, so I'd like to forward them to you, Warren. One question is, how would you explain reduced contrast after cataract surgery and LASIK?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, we have the equivalent of like a big jumbotron in our office. It's a big LED display that's hooked up to our topographer, and we show them. So explaining is good, but showing is better. And if you show a patient reduced contrast, say at 6 millimeter pupil and a 3 millimeter pupil, you really don't have to do any explaining at all. And with some of the newer topographers, you can check or uncheck different aberrations, like the I-star and like the Atlas. And basically you take out the second order aberrations, and that shows patients how they see with glasses. You take out the third and fourth order aberrations, and that shows patients how they would see with a contact lens. You show them at 6 millimeters, it's a worst case scenario. Bring the pupil down to 3 millimeters, it's better. And basically that is the explanation. Trying to do it by using words is kind of difficult, because a patient's reference and our reference might be quite different. But I would recommend that all of us who implant multifocal lenses or see patients with prior refractive surgery do add some sort of big LED display in your diagnostics room, so you can show people what all these things mean. And usually there's no question. 88-year-old grandmas completely understand. And now, because you've shown it to them after surgery, if they experience it, it's not your fault. If they find out about it after surgery and didn't know about it beforehand, it becomes your fault. And then that can be a real difficult discussion at times.
Thank you very much. Another question which we have here is, where can you advise to read more about this topic, topography and sonic analysis? Is there a textbook or something you would recommend?
I really wish there was. And one of the reasons why we started teaching a 90-minute course at ASCRS is because there is nothing. And believe it or not, this course at ASCRS was really the first time that this topic had been explored. So if you want to go into this in more detail, and you're going to be traveling to, say, the Las Vegas meeting in July for ASCRS, do take the course at ASCRS, and we'll go into this in even more detail. But right now, there really isn't, and I wish there was.
Okay. Another question, if you have to select keratometry readings, on which one would you rely more, lens star or an autokeratometer, if the readings are inconsistent?
Okay. Well, the lens star is an autokeratometer, of course, and we prefer the lens star because it has so many different readings. And I think it has 32 measurement points in 2 rings at 1.65 and 2.3 millimeters. So our go-to keratometry device for people with prior refractive surgery, and also the Toric IOL, is always the lens star. That's what we use. Remember, we showed the IOLmaster case for IOLmaster 500 and earlier. It's 3 measurement points above, 3 measurement points below, and a lot of extrapolation iteration. And where is the older IOLmaster always the least accurate? It's always at 90 degrees, isn't it? Because it's midway between 2 points that are separated by 60 degrees. So with that much extrapolation, it's not going to nearly be as accurate. So I would use the lens star, but I would also look to make sure that lines up with the power distribution, the anterior corneal axial curvature map. Again, a measurement's only as good as our ability to know what it means. And if we have some form of validation, it's really helpful. And combining autokeratometry with a picture of the power distribution across the anterior cornea gives you tremendous insight into what's going on with that patient. We want to get out of the habit of just pushing buttons and accepting keratometry readings like they came from heaven. No, they're just a device. It's just a measurement, and we need to know what the measurement means.
Thank you. The next question we have here is, what are your views on the new Alcon Vivity lens and the concept of wavefront modulation in the IOL?
Well, the Vivity lens is phase shifting is what it is. So a portion of the incoming wavefront is shifted in its phase. And then what that does is extends the depth of field by preserving contrast across an interval. It can only be done so far, because if you phase shift more and more of the incoming wavefront, what you get is a second image. So that's why the Vivity wouldn't be used for like 2 or 2.5 or 3 diopters of presbyopia correction, because you would kind of inch out that second image to the point that you would see 2 images. So it's just a different way of presbyopia correction, and it has kind of a similar range as say the Symphony. I think where the Vivity might be helpful is that you're going to have less of the characteristic dysphotopsia, but it's still not going to be for close reading because that's not how that works. But it's phase shifting rather than wavefront modulation.
Thank you, Warren. Next question we have is, what should be the limit of magnitude of aberrations beyond which we should not go for a multifocal IOL?
Yeah, so this is a question that I get all the time, and I have struggled with how to answer this. Remember in that one picture that we showed with the violin chord, aberrations exist as a dance. They exist as many different values combined. So if you have a high spherical aberration value and a low coma value, that may be better tolerated by the human eye because spherical aberration is a naturally occurring aberration. So say 0.35 microns of spherical aberration, the patient may tolerate very well. But 0.35 microns of vertical or horizontal coma is a killer for diffractive multifocal lenses because the loss of contrast is too great. So this is where image simulation comes in really well, is if you simulate an eye and they have like 0.3 microns of, say, vertical coma at a 6 millimeter pupil, you can see how the contrast is reduced. Hemsa and his group in Alexandria, Egypt, proposed that 0.3 microns of vertical or horizontal coma at a 6 millimeter aperture be the cutoff for a diffractive multifocal lens. But let's say that same person has no spherical aberration. Well, that would probably be pretty well tolerated. But if they had 0.4 microns of spherical aberration, it wouldn't be tolerated at all because you'd lose a lot of contrast. So the answer is you have to look at the whole aberration profile, and if possible, look at the image simulation, and then that will help you to understand. And a lot of it comes with experience. We see a lot of these patients. So over many years, we've kind of gained an insight after talking with them afterwards as to what is tolerated. And one of the real fun things about the iStar that'll soon be released is that it does the Zernike tree and it also does the image simulation. So you can actually see with the patient right there exactly what it's like. So all the things that we've been showing tonight are going to be included in the iStar. And I think this is the only biometer in the world that has all of these features in one device. And for those of you that are implanting multifocal lenses and seeing patients with prior refractive surgery, this is really a great gift from Haag-Streit to help us do a better job.
Thank you very much. Next question we have is, Dr. Hill, what's your thinking about the information you get from full total corneal power? If you would look at it at the total corneal Zernike tree and the difference in axis and power from simulated case to front case to total case and total power axis, how do you foresee the future of corneal readings there?
Well, that's about 4 questions in one, I think.
I know.
Yeah. Our ability to accurately measure the posterior cornea is getting better. There's no question about that. But there's some challenges with the posterior cornea. And I think the total corneal power compared to front surface cornea with some basic assumptions about the cornea it's about the same. I don't see a really big improvement with total corneal power. You would never want to use simulated Ks for lens power calculations. Simulated Ks are a topographer trying to be a keratometer. And I think Graham Barrett, myself, and probably Doug Koch, we all agree that very good autokeratometry is probably the standard for things like the Toric IOL. That gives us the most reproducible results. So I think until we get a lot better for measuring the posterior cornea, the anterior corneal autokeratometry, reflective keratometry, probably does a very good job. And what will the future hold? Boy, it's hard to tell because technology keeps getting better, and as something advances, then we need to be able to evaluate it and see if it's really worth something. For those of us that develop lens power calculation methods and look at this very, very carefully, I think we're at the point right now where we're limited by technology. I work in the area of artificial intelligence, and if you have really good metrics, you can have incredible artificial intelligence models. But I think right now in the year 2001, we're limited by technology. And remember, reflective keratometry was from what, 1859, 1860. I mean, this isn't exactly new technology, but it's developed to a point where it's kind of the best of what we have. I think we need another breakthrough like we had with the measurement of axial length when we went from immersion biometry to optical biometry. It was like the heavens opened up and we didn't have to worry about that anymore. My hope is in the next few years, there's going to be another advance like that on the horizon that's going to make things better for the Ks. And again, for those of us that develop lens power calculation methods, the Ks are probably the most problematic area. Let me just make one other point that I think is very important. And we walked into this because I operate in the desert. I'm here in Arizona where everybody has a dry eye. But the optimization of the ocular surface prior to biometry can be a complete game changer in terms of accuracy. That involves, lid scrubs, warm compresses, frequent artificial tears, 1 to 2 weeks before biometry. And the accuracy of biometry, the normalization of the anterior cornea with an axial curvature map is significant if you optimize the ocular surface. And so I would recommend that everybody do that before they do biometry. And I think that's good for several percentage point increase in your half diopter accuracy.
Thank you very much. We have another question. How much importance do you give to angle alpha when deciding on multifocal IOLs?
Sure. Well, that's a very common question. The differences between angle kappa, which many instruments come with, and angle alpha. I don't see angle kappa as really anything useful. It's the difference between the visual axis and the center of the pupil. That's really not where things are important. Angle alpha is the difference between the center of the visual axis and the optical axis. And I think angle alpha is really what we need to think about in determining the appropriateness of, say, a diffractive multifocal IOL. If you have a very large angle alpha, there may be a disconnect and the lens may be relatively decentered. So I think angle alpha is really the thing you want to look at. A lot of people say a number of 0.5 millimeters. I think that's kind of arbitrary. We look at it, and even at 0.5, we're still putting in those lenses. But I think angle alpha is really what you want to look at. Unfortunately, only a few instruments come with angle alpha. I think the iTrace has it and a few others, but that would be what I would look at.
Then we're having a question from the chat section. Treat a patient with decenter myopic ablation, do a surface touch-up and place a multifocal or EDOF IOL. Would you recommend this? So the basic question is if you have a decentered. Yeah.
Okay, if you have a decentered ablation, what you have is coma. Remember, you're all now experts on that. The moment you see a decentered ablation, you know you have coma. And the EDOF lenses, like the Symphony, they, at least if you look at the patent, it is a diffractive technology. Coma values are killers of multifocal IOLs. It's a form of irregular astigmatism. So think about the days when we put in the Restore and later with the Symphony. Any sort of decentration, can be an issue. These lenses are exquisitely sensitive to decentration, and also regular astigmatism. So let's say you have 3/4 of a diopter of regular astigmatism. In our practice, we would go after that. Well, what if you had a diopter of asymmetric decentered astigmatism? It just doesn't work. So the problem is that coma reduces contrast, and these lenses also can reduce contrast. So a decentered ablation means increased coma means decreased contrast, and you add that to a diffractive multifocal lens, and you run the risk of an unhappy patient. Now you can measure it. You can measure it with your topographer, and if you have 0.3 or 0.4 microns of vertical or horizontal coma, then I would think twice about putting in a diffractive multifocal. And I would also show the simulated image to the patient, because that's really where the money is. If you show them that image and say, my God, I couldn't possibly live with that, you've saved yourself a lot of heartache.
Thank you very much, Warren. So I think it was an extremely informative evening tonight, and thank you for all the very good questions which we had. The webinar is also going to be online on our YouTube channel and on the Haag-Streit webpage, so you can always have a look at it later on as well, to have second try and really go into deep in this very, very important topic. Thank you very much, Warren. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here. Have a good evening.
Good evening to everyone. Bye-bye.